The border didn't move closer, it moved everywhere. You're told this is about immigration, about a line on a map far away. But at the same time, a national emergency is declared, military power is unlocked, and Homeland Security task forces are activated in all 50 states. That's the paradox. A border policy that no longer lives at the border. And it matters to you because when every state becomes a border zone, every routine interaction becomes something else. This isn't just about who crosses into the country. It's about what kind of country you wake up in next. On paper, the administration calls this a whole-of-government approach. In practice, it means agencies that never touched immigration are suddenly pulled into a single mission. Surveillance expands, enforcement blurs, the line between domestic policing and immigration disappears in plain sight. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This didn't roll out slowly, and it didn't happen by accident. It happened all at once, quietly, across the entire federal machine. And once you see how that machine was built, the rest of the story snaps into focus. What you're seeing now didn't start with a single order or a single headline. It started with a shift in framing. Immigration enforcement was no longer treated as one policy area among many. It was elevated into a central organizing principle of the federal government. A national emergency declaration opened doors that are usually locked. Military resources became available. Interagency coordination became mandatory. Homeland Security task forces were rolled out in all 50 states, not just near the border. That detail matters because it signals scale. This isn't a response to a spike or a surge. It's a redesign. Only part of the picture was shown publicly. More enforcement, more removals, more control. What wasn't emphasized is how many agencies were pulled into this orbit, including ones with no historical role in immigration at all. This is where the pattern starts to emerge. When a government reassigns unrelated institutions to a single mission, it's not reacting. It's retooling. And that raises a different question entirely. If the border was the problem, why restructure the entire federal system? And if this is the foundation, what kind of structure was it designed to support next? Here's the claim that changes how this looks. This wasn't built to fix a backlog. It was built to overwhelm it. The numbers tell the story. While the immigration case backlog has climbed to nearly 3.8 million, new legislation injected $170 billion directly into enforcement. Not courts, not judges. Enforcement. At the same time, the number of immigration judges was capped. That's not an oversight. That's a design choice. $45 billion was funneled into detention camps, another $46 billion into walls. Physical infrastructure that doesn't speed up hearings or improve accuracy, but does one thing extremely well: hold people and remove them fast. On paper, this is framed as efficiency. In reality, it creates a choke point where due process slows down and enforcement speeds up. Notice what's missing from this spending spree. There's no comparable investment in resolving cases, clearing dockets, or expanding review. Justice is treated as a bottleneck, not a goal. And here's where the story flips. When you build a system this large, this expensive, and this permanent, it doesn't exist to be used sparingly. It needs volume, it needs throughput. And once that machine is funded for years in advance, the pressure isn't whether to use it. The pressure is how to feed it. So the question becomes uncomfortable very quickly. Where do the numbers come from next? Once that funding was locked in, the scope expanded fast. This is where escalation becomes visible. Agencies that once focused on entirely different missions were folded into immigration enforcement almost overnight. The FBI, traditionally aimed at counterterrorism and serious crime, reassigned nearly a quarter of its entire agent pool. In major field offices, that number climbed close to half. At the same time, the Bureau of Prisons, the U.S. Marshals, and even the ATF were pulled into the same orbit. This kind of blending has a precedent, but not a comfortable one. In past moments of national fear, governments centralized power first, then justified it later. What's different now is how normalized it feels. There was no single announcement saying the FBI would become an immigration force. It just happened, quietly, gradually, and then all at once. Resources meant to investigate violent crime were redirected toward tracking visa overstays and immigration violations. That shift matters because it reveals priority. When every badge becomes interchangeable, enforcement stops being targeted and starts being systemic. This is where something that should feel extraordinary begins to feel routine. And that normalization is the real escalation, because once this level of coordination feels normal, the next expansion no longer sounds extreme. It sounds inevitable. Now the evidence gets harder to ignore. While officials insisted this was about security, the actions pointed somewhere else entirely. At the same moment enforcement inside the US was expanding, access from the outside was being slammed shut. Visa processing was frozen indefinitely for 75 countries. Not slowed, not reviewed. Frozen. That includes nations across Latin America, Africa, and Eurasia. The criteria were blunt. If an applicant was deemed likely to become a public charge based on age, health, or finances, they were out. Word said this was about risk management. Actions showed something closer to filtration. Billions of people were effectively screened out before they ever applied. Here's the contradiction that changes how you see it. While the system claims to target undocumented migration, it simultaneously blocks legal pathways on a massive scale. Notice what they didn't deny. There was no promise this freeze would end, no timeline, no benchmark. This wasn't a pause, it was a lock. And once legal doors close, pressure doesn't disappear. It reroutes. This is the moment where enforcement stops being reactive and starts shaping demographics, not by accident, but by design. And once you accept that, the next move feels less like policy and more like strategy. Then everything starts accelerating at once. Diplomacy hardens, enforcement globalizes, pressure replaces negotiation. Foreign governments are warned that refusing US deportees will come at a cost. Visas are threatened. Diplomatic access is leveraged. In extreme cases, even strategic assets are invoked as bargaining chips. Countries like Sierra Leone and Niger face travel bans after resisting. This isn't subtle. It's force applied through paperwork and power. At the same time, a new practice quietly takes hold: third country deportations. Migrants are flown not to their home countries, but to places they've never lived. Rwanda, South Sudan, Panama. Using a rarely invoked legal provision, people are removed to destinations where they have no legal status, no support system, and no clear future. And once those planes land, the US government often admits it doesn't track what happens next. This is where the system starts losing visibility, even as it gains reach. Speed replaces certainty. Removal replaces responsibility. What happens when enforcement moves faster than accountability can follow? At this point, it stops being abstract and starts hitting real lives, including yours. Inside the United States, enforcement turns into a daily manhunt. A confirmed arrest quota of 3,000 people per day reshapes behavior on the ground. When numbers matter more than judgment, targets widen. Leadership that fails to hit quotas is removed and replaced by more aggressive figures. Raids expand beyond the margins. In one case, federal agents stormed a Hyundai electric vehicle plant in Georgia, detaining nearly 500 workers in a single operation. This wasn't hidden. It was on camera. A major manufacturing hub disrupted overnight. Alliances strained, supply chains rattled. And for ordinary people, the message is simple. Legal or not, essential or not, no place is neutral anymore. Workplaces, neighborhoods, routine commutes all become points of risk. You don't need ideology to feel that pressure. You feel it when fear enters normal life, when uncertainty becomes background noise. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because what looks like enforcement on paper feels very different when it shows up where you earn a living. And the question hanging in the air now is whether this kind of pressure can stay contained. At this stage, outrage misses the point. The more important question is how a system like this sustains itself. The answer is incentives. Once enforcement becomes a permanent structure with guaranteed funding, it no longer responds to conditions. It responds to targets. Budgets are justified by activity. Activity demands volume. Volume demands broader definitions of who counts. That's how systems drift. Fear becomes leverage. Spectacle becomes proof of effectiveness. And complexity becomes a shield. The more agencies involved, the harder it is to assign responsibility. Each part can claim it's only doing its piece. This is how extraordinary power hides inside routine process. Nothing here requires a single villain. It only requires alignment. Political reward for being tough, bureaucratic reward for hitting numbers, media reward for dramatic footage. Over time, enforcement stops being a tool and becomes the point. And once that happens, restraint feels like failure. This is why systems like this rarely reverse on their own. They don't need intent to keep moving. They only need momentum. And momentum, once built into the structure, tends to look for its next outlet. From here, the path forward splits, but neither direction is calm. One possibility is acceleration. More funding gets deployed. More agencies are folded in. The logic stays the same. Numbers justify the system, and the system demands numbers. In that future, enforcement expands into new spaces simply because it can. The other possibility is friction. Legal challenges pile up. International partners push back. Economic damage becomes harder to ignore, but even that path isn't a reset. It's a slowdown under pressure, not a dismantling. What's striking is how little depends on a single decision now. The machinery is already built, the money is already allocated, the roles are already reassigned. That means the next phase doesn't need a dramatic announcement. It only needs continuation, and that's what makes this moment unstable. When systems reach this scale, small inputs can trigger large consequences. A single incident, a single expansion, a single precedent. The next move may already be forming, not in public speeches, but in internal memos and quiet extensions. And by the time it becomes visible, it may already feel normal. Strip away the politics, and one insight remains. This story isn't about who gets removed. It's about what happens when enforcement becomes identity. When a government organizes itself around exclusion, that logic doesn't stay contained. It spreads. What began as border control turns into a governing philosophy. And once that philosophy is funded, normalized, and automated, it reshapes everything around it. The question isn't whether this system works. It's what it turns the country into while it does. If you want to understand where this goes next, you can't just watch the headlines. You have to watch the structure underneath them. That's what we'll keep breaking down here. Follow, subscribe, and stay with this story, because the most important part isn't what already happened. It's what this system is now capable of doing next.